Welcome to Sundays with Jane Eyre. This is episode 4, This Doctrine of Endurance. We'll be covering chapters 5 and 6 of Charlotte Bronte's Jane Eyre today. I'm Edward G. Pettit of the Rosenbach in Philadelphia, and joining me today is everyone's favorites as co-hosts. Sorry, other co-hosts. I don't mean that to disparage other co-hosts, but people really love when you guys are on. The Ghoul Guides, Dr. Lauren Nixon and Mary Going. Welcome back.
It's always great to be back.
Ed. Hi, everyone.
I love having you here. Thank you so much. So, and I never have to worry about filling up time. So we're always gonna be battling the time limit on the show with both of you, and I love that. So, welcome to all our erudite Brontosaurs and airheads. If you're new to the show, just a note on our format. If you're watching live on Zoom, the chat is for you to talk to each other and talk to each other. You guys will. It's always a lot of fun to read after the show, but I can't follow it during it. So if you have a question for us, put it in the Q&A feature on Zoom, and we'll do our best to hit as many of them as possible today. But we're also streaming live on YouTube, and encourage everyone, which I also encourage everyone to like and subscribe on YouTube and leave a comment there. Liking, subscribing, and comments, even on past episodes, help us gain greater visibility and grow our audience. And if you're watching live there, thanks for watching. And if you put a comment in the chat or a question in the chat, I will get to it after the show. What's new with the Ghoul Guides?
What is new with us? Mary is about to.
I've been quite busy, so I haven't really been able to do as much as we would have liked. But we have lots of plans. So I guess
yes, we do. Yeah, we have some exciting stuff planned. So we have our new show, which the first episode you might have seen. So last week's co-host Kathleen Hudson was on our first episode.
And people can find that at your YouTube, Ghoul Guides, right?
Yes, it's called the Ghoul Guides Association. So it will be in future. We're hoping to put that out kind of once a month, and it will be us talking to academics, talking to, creators about all things Gothic. And yeah, we're in the process of talking to people about who wants to be on and when we can film. So we're really excited about that. But Mary is very busy doing something very important because she is finishing up her thesis for submission.
Yeah.
But if you liked Kathleen, if you're interested in Kathleen's research, she talks about her book, goes into depth about that. So if you were interested in Servants in the Gothic, in last week's episode, you can check out the interview we did with her, and also with another one of our friends, Dr. Hannah Moss, who has some really great research into Gothic and the arts. So definitely check that out, and then watch the space for more.
Excellent.
More people.
That will be great. I just want to remind everybody too, next week my co-host will be Michael Stewart. He is the creator of the Bronte Stones project. Have you guys seen the Bronte Stones? They go from their birthplace
it's the trail,
up to Haworth. And on the stones they have quotes and poems and and some that were specially commissioned for this. He was behind that project. He also wrote Ill Will, the Untold Story of Heathcliff, a novel about all the stuff we don't know about Heathcliff, which I haven't read yet. I'll have to one of these days. But he's also author of the brand new Walking the Invisible, following in the Bronte's footsteps. So kind of part meditation on walking in nature and also about the Brontes. And I'm really looking forward to having him on next week, everyone. But this week, it's the Ghoul Guides. And you guys did you notice there's somebody new in the picture here with me? This is my Samuel Johnson statue. He's about 15 inches high. I love Johnson and read a lot of them. And I have a whole bookcase full of Johnsoniana in the other room. And I actually have a little statue. He's really fragile at the bottom. It's been a little broken, but I brought him out for the show. I not only have one Samuel Johnson statue, I actually have two. This guy's hat broke a little bit, but it's the same statue, just painted differently. So I thought, Raselas will come up today. I have some things to say about Raselas. And so he's definitely going to join us. He's joining us for the show. I hope I don't knock him and really break him. So
fabulous.
last week we hit chapters 3 and 4. We had Mr. Lloyd, who was very nice to Jane and listened to her, understood her situation. And then of course we had, Mr. Brocklehurst and Jane's unintended sass. I must keep in good health and not die in order to avoid hell. And of course, our very intended admonitions of Mrs. Reed in her high savage voice, yelling at her and really, speaking the truth to her in a way that was both honest and cruel to somebody who was also cruel. And then at the end of the chapter, Bessie and Jane seem to come to this understanding that, Bessie recognizes that Jane is, a different kind of person than she thinks a child should be, and kind of accepts that. And they have this nice embrace at the end before Jane goes away. Is there anything you guys, I know you didn't prep for this, but I just thought, anything you guys wanted to add about these situations, about that meeting with Brocklehurst, about Bessie and Jane? We kind of really went in depth with this stuff last week. And if you have anything to add before we get started, we can fill up the time with that. I love that.
I think maybe something to think about when we get to Helen in chapter 6, I think, and kind of her ideas about the afterlife and about the the possibility of hell and that kind of thing. It really contrasts with Mr. Brocklehurst. He's quite, fire and brimstone and eternal damnation and punishment, and also that kind of, Calvinist theology that's quite, focusing on punishment and the damned and the saved as being already predestined. So that's what I'd say, is just think back to Brocklehurst when we get to that bit with Helen.
Good. Well, because we'll definitely talk about that. The whole universal salvation that Charlotte Bronte believes in. And I know that's going to be in your notes. So I know we'll get that today.
Yeah. I mean, obviously, like, Kathleen has fantastic insight into Bessie and Jane's relationship and kind of how that shapes relationships going forwards. And I do think it's really important to keep that in mind, the way that Bessie is able to come to an understanding and an acceptance of Jane that other characters at the beginning of the novel aren't, especially when we get to Mr. Rochester and we get to Adele, and we think about the kind of quite complex hierarchical social structure that happens there, and particularly with characters like, we'll meet Blanche later on and characters like that. But I suppose really the thing for me is always thinking about the way that it highlights hypocrisy through the eyes of children, because this is something that's quite new at this point. We have a lot of characters in the 18th century who, are these like virtuous, prodigious kind of, 8 and 10-year-olds, but they're usually male. They're usually young men who go, oh, I can't believe this. And they kind of almost mimic the sort of like Jesus in the temple. They're like these young men who just understand intrinsically that things are wrong and right. And this is a young woman. This is a young girl. And I think that is a really interesting flip of a lot of those earlier tropes, that you get, this young Jane who doesn't know much but knows enough to know that's kind of ridiculous and that's not right. And the way that highlights the hypocrisy, and you have more of the dynamic, not only is this young and old, it's male and female, it's rich and poor, it's, just height wise, things like that. It's a really interesting dynamic that she draws. And I think you should think about that when we get to Rochester, actually. This novel does a lot of really interesting things with gender dynamics, and do think about the way that Rochester interacts with Jane and the way that St. John interacts with Jane, and compare it back to Brocklehurst, because I think in both of those characters you have that, older male character who's trying to, instruct. We talk so much about didacticism when we talk about these novels, reading to educate, writing to educate. Where's the agency lie in that? And Jane is a self-taught child at this point in time. I think that's a really fascinating thing to kind of hold on to when we look at her relationships as an adult. That's
Right.
my main thing, really.
Good. And we'll really, and some of that, education of a girl, we hit a lot of those issues in this, and a lot, of course, obviously brought from Charlotte Bronte's own experiences in the Cohenbridge school that come in, that have a big bearing on Lowood and how she portrays these girls getting an education. But we start with chapter 5. 5 o'clock had hardly struck on the morning of the 19th of January. So, and she's up and about before the sun has even risen. And the sun, the moon, the half moon is still sending rays through the narrow window near my crib. And I think somebody mentioned this last week too, about crib and the idea that, like, is she still sleeping in the little crib with bars? And I did do some research and discovered that, the crib was more, there was a more widespread use of the word crib just as a child's bed in the 19th century. It wasn't necessarily what we call a crib with the ribbed, bars keeping the child safe, not imprisoned, but safe. But also the fact that I think that Bronte is using this word crib is just reminding us of how young Jane is, that she's still in a very small bed that she's probably had for most of her childhood, if not all of it. I wonder if the Reed children are still sleeping in their crib, in their first beds.
Well, it's probably also a trundle bed. So if any of you have been, if you've ever been to these kind of 19th century houses, you'll see often that the nursery beds are these kind of more kind of metal framed trundle beds. And most younger children slept in those because they could, be pushed into different rooms. They could go in the nurses' rooms, they could go in the nursery. And then you had like a proper, wooden bed when you got older. So it also, I think it's also drawing attention again to not only how young she is, but how a crib, a trundle bed is more like a servant's bed. It's not the type of bed that you would sleep in as the children of, an upper class family. So it's very much also kind of holding on to the fact that she is the poor relation, and has to sleep in a crappy little bed rather than, a proper bed in a proper room.
Yeah, absolutely. Bessie asks her if she's going to go bid Mrs. goodbye. That would be Mrs. Reed. And I love this little thing that Jane said. Well, I love all her sass in this. But she came to my crib last night when you were gone down to supper and said I need not disturb her in the morning, or my cousins either. She told me to remember that she had always been my best friend and to speak of her and be grateful to her accordingly. I mean, Mrs. Reed trying to head off Jane telling stories about her treatment. And Jane just said she turned from her to the wall. Bessie thinks that's wrong, but Jane says it was quite right, Bessie. Your missus has not been my friend. She has been my foe. And that kind of honesty in her, we had it in the last couple of chapters too, that Jane's at this point in her life, and I think the book has made clear that she's only just begun to do this, and this is why all the upset happens, is because Jane is finally understands enough, or has been put into the kind of bullied position enough that she's starting to answer back and to let people know what's what, and no, you can't say that. That's not true. A bit precocious, but it's also a narrator, an older narrator back writing this. I meant to look up from the last time. I don't think this is a spoiler, but just to know what, do you guys know how old roughly Jane Eyre is when she goes back to write the story? I can't remember if the text tells us later or we just have to figure that out.
So it's 10, she tells us at the end it's 10 years. So we
After the
can
end.
rough.
So it's 10
after
years
the end,
after the
she
end of the
says-
book. Okay.
Yeah. So which would put her in her 30s.
In her 30s somewhere, maybe early to mid.
She's still young because
Yeah.
she's young when she meets Rochester. She's with the Rivers family for about a year, I think we put it at. She then goes back. So yeah, we think she's kind of in her 30s. Because yeah, she says, I'm pretty sure she says it's been 10 years. So yeah, she'd be about in her 30s.
Laura asks if about Adele sleeping in a bed or a crib. Of course, she was younger. I'd rather talk about Adele later, but when we get there. But yeah, but as far as I know, her bed isn't mentioned. But Adam asks, did the visit actually happen, or is Jane just telling Bessie that? That's interesting.
Yeah.
What do you guys think?
I think it did, because this is like a major house and what happens outside your house. And there's this whole thing about the way you treat your servants and the things you say in front of your servants. So for example, in Pride and Prejudice, there's a whole thing where Lizzie is like despairing because her mother says things in front of the housekeeper.
Mm-hmm.
And Lizzie knows that, they shouldn't be talking about Lydia eloping in front of the housekeeper, because the housekeeper will tell her, like, you can't expect the servants have their own, gossip network. You can't expect the servants not to tell people. And Jane has lived in this like in-between space where they can be awful to her and it's fine because she's not a servant. And it's that moment of realization that she is going to leave and that other people will now find out about the way that she's been treated. So this is very much gaslighting. This is Mrs. Reed kind of being like, remember that I have always been your friend and I looked after you, and you'd be destitute if it wasn't for me. So when you go to school and you tell other people talk to you, you need to tell them that I was good to you. Like, don't you dare go and tell people that I'm a bad mistress, because she will probably treat her servants fine. Mm-hmm. They treat Jane the way they treat Jane because she is ambiguous. If you beat your servants, if you're a terrible mistress, the servants tell each other and people don't want to work for you. You don't get good staff. So, it's that kind of, it's highlighting that in-between status that Jane is neither the family nor the servants. And it is essentially Mrs. Reed kind of being like, you better go and maintain our reputation. Like, don't you dare.
And Jane's honest too. She's not like, if this happened, she's going to say that it happened.
Yes, she has no reason to lie.
But there is the possibility that this is kind of like, this happens in her head, like that it's almost like a dream kind of thing. Like, she imagined.
Once you start picking that thread, where do you stop? This is this is a work of fiction. Why would child Jane lie, and why would adult Jane recollecting lie? And mm-hmm. we have to, I guess, accept this on some level. We can see that some of the scenes that Jane's describing are colored by her recollections, but mm-hmm. I think this is written by Charlotte Bronte, so we have to think about what the scene is doing. I think it's exactly what Lauren's just said. It's showing that kind of dynamic between the servants and the family and Jane, mm-hmm. and it's showing that Mrs. Reed doesn't want Jane to go off and tell people how horrible she is. But Jane doesn't care to share this story with Bessie. And
it's an interesting point about the way we read text, because it is important to read, as we said when I said this when we did Frankenstein, like, bear in mind this is a recollection. We should still consider Jane to be an unreliable narrator, and we mm-hmm. should totally think about the fact that she is writing this, 20, 25 years down the line, that she is coloured by her reflections on what she knows now and the situation that she's now in. And definitely mm-hmm. question the way that Jane remembers things, But I think and this is just from like more of an academic perspective, we run a risk of, you know, running completely down the wrong track and missing the really important point when we think about things like, is it real? Is it made up? Because we have to have the indication. Otherwise you can kind of end up, like Mary said, you know, once you pull at that thread, everything kind of falls apart. So for me, I would say, yeah, I definitely think it happened. Whether or not the tone of which Mrs. Reed says things is the way that it was, whether or not she was just genuinely concerned about her reputation, you know, we could read this as potentially a moment where a woman has this realization that this child is about to leave, and actually maybe she's, you know, lying to herself. It could be that Mrs. Reed genuinely believes that she's been good to Jane. You know, we are coloured by Jane's recollection, but I think we should think about it more in terms of memory and in terms of like narration, rather than like, did it happen, did it not happen? Because we are thinking about how, you know, think about your own childhood memories and think about the way that childhood is formed here. And it does bring up a really interesting conversation about childhood and children's education and kind of recollection, which is something that's just beginning to come to the forefront at this point in time.
It's not the first time that Jane will be visited in the night. So this is something that will occur in this book too. So she's walking out, and I love that. Goodbye to Gateshead, cried I as we passed through the hall, went out at the front door, like just shouting out goodbye to Gateshead. I love that from this, you know, from young Jane. It's so hard not to be like patronizing towards her when she's doing these kind of like adultish, you know, things and being so bold. You know, I don't want to call her spunky or anything like that, but God, she's just great. I just love her attitude. That she's, you know, I don't know, I'm a Philly kid, so she's got some of that Philly attitude in her. So that's good. Maybe that's the first time it's ever been said about Jane Eyre. She's got a little Philly attitude in her. The servants out at the gatehouse wonder, you know, why she's going to go so far alone. And that's, you know, so that's something that's, you know, pointed out to us, that Jane sets off alone in the dark, you know, at 10 years old, is I don't think it's cruel so much as clearly neglectful of Mrs. Reed and other characters. Even the servants notice it. So, and then they'll notice it again when she's picked up or at one of the stops in between.
It's continually like highlighted, the fact that she's so small, she's so young. It's dark, mm-hmm. and the weather is horrible, and she's doing this quite long journey on her own. It's noted at the coach house, and then when she gets to Lowood as well. And also another thing that's repeated is the fact that she's not eating. So here, Bessie took her some food and she doesn't eat it. At the coach house, there's some food and she doesn't eat it. She's offered supper, you know, and we get there. But there's all these things that just kind of, it's like repeating this. Jane is small, she's young, she's on her own. It's neglectful, as you say. The weather's not great, and she's going on this really long journey, just on her own. Who knows what will happen?
Yeah, and it's kind of like picking up on a Gothic trope. Mary knows this. I always point to a bit in Northanger Abbey, which is the moment when Captain Tilney sends Catherine Morland back on her own, doesn't send a servant or anybody in the carriage to accompany her, and that's willful. It's actually very nice to send someone alone in a carriage, especially at this point in time. You know, to send a child, especially a female child, alone on that journey is willfully kind of putting them in danger.
Well, before she goes, she you know, gives Bessie a nice hug and clings, and I clung with kisses. So they have a nice parting, and it seems as if that relationship is at least, and perhaps this is later why, you know, Jane, we were talking about this a couple chapters ago, but why Jane thinks so fondly of Bessie, because people were like, Bessie didn't treat her that well. But I think we've seen in this that they do have a kind of, they take care of their relationship and figure things out and understand each other at this point. But talk about Gothic tropes. Thus was I severed from Bessie, and Gay said, thus whirled away to unknown, and as I then deemed, remote and mysterious regions. And a little bit later it is, we descended a valley dark with wood, and long after night had overclouded the prospect, I heard wild wind rushing amongst the trees. So it seems to me that these kind of, the language or these, Gothic overtones.
I really like the idea that Jane Eyre is essentially writing herself into a Gothic story, and she's very much constructing it in that way, with all the references to the weather and the mystery and the unknown, and almost that kind of the preternatural aspect of nature that almost seems to be coming alive with the wind making that noise. But also, I mean, even here she talks about the stories that Bessie tells her, and it's about, she was scared of getting kidnapped, and you can just imagine like her and Bessie sat by the fireside telling these stories, and here she is, and so who knows, like someone reading this for the first time might also have been reading this novel by the fireside. So it's very much that kind of that idea of storytelling, and a specific genre of storytelling, with the kind of the Gothic tropes and that kind of stuff. I think it's a really interesting idea.
And also the kinds of stories that Jane likes. She says she loves the stories like Gulliver and what she really identifies with is going off to strange lands. And here she is getting to do that.
Yeah, 100%.
She calls the day. I'm sorry, God.
I should say she uses words like bewildered. There is that kind of that real sense of like the unknown and not necessarily otherness, because it's almost like Jane is the other, but she's going into these new situations. But she very specifically emotionally describes that feeling of that almost uncanniness of like, this is strange, this is bewildering, this is almost unnatural because it's so unknown to me.
She sees that the day seemed to me of a preternatural length, the word that we don't use as much anymore, kind of supernatural, has replaced, preternatural. But it's the same idea, this other worldly, not natural way of is how the day is going for her. When they get to the inn, she says, I was carried into an inn. And then later when they stop at Lowood, is a little girl called Jane Eyre here, and I was then lifted out. And this sense also of her, kind of helplessness, that people are just carrying her into these little places. She's not in control. And nor would she be, as this very small 10-year-old, but emphasized in the text. And as soon as she arrives at Lowood, it continues. Rain, wind, and darkness filled the air. The door is shut and they locked it behind her. There's an uncertain light as she comes into the room with the hearth. She's entered in that strange realm that must have been frightening for her, and I imagine it was frightening in a sense for Charlotte Bronte, as she's kind of sent off to the school that I'll talk about in a bit, because her sisters are already there, and then Charlotte is sent there on a journey and has to arrive, and because we know for certain that there's so many little details about Lowood that actually happened to Charlotte in life, I just I can't help but think that she's envisioning her arrival at school. Now, perhaps it wasn't. I mean, she's a writer and she's using her imagination, but the idea of coming to a strange place must have been really, because she's even younger. I think she was 8 when she went. So.
Yeah, I think so, because her sisters were like 3 and 4 years older than her.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure I'm remembering that right. Yeah, so she she's kind of sent, I think, younger because her sisters are already there, which happens quite a lot. Like if there was already a sister or a cousin at the school, it was acceptable to send a girl younger, and often you did go in pairs. You didn't necessarily kind of go alone. You went with the girl closest in age to you, and then another one might be sent later on. It was quite a common thing to do. But again, I always think when I read this bit, it reminds me of like, when you're a kid and you fall asleep in the car and you kind of come to as you're being picked, like, as you like someone's like lifting you out of the car, and you have that weird kind of like strange semi coming to consciousness, like what's happening and where am I going? Like I think she captures that childishness.
I don't remember any of that.
She captures that really, really well, which I just think is I don't really have anything academic to say. I just think it's a really nice moment because you don't always see childish experiences represented accurately in fiction. And I just think that's a really nice moment.
I do know it just from my own kids and doing that all the time. And I would think of it all the time as I'm picking them up. And I would often think, I wish people would do this for me. I wish somebody would just be able to come over and like, Ed, you're real tired. Pick me up and carry me over something. That would be great because I don't remember it happening. I'm sure it did. But I can't remember it. But yeah, so, we have because this hit us a little before, and I just wanted, Liliana had put a comment in here about, she says, it's important to keep in mind that the adult Jane who writes the story with all the bias that she is totally entitled to have. And I think she put that out when we were still talking about Jane interpreting what happened with Mrs. Reed, but it really goes for this whole book that that idea that sure, she's entitled to have these thoughts, and as a narrator, even as an unreliable narrator, I think I'm going to believe her more than some of the others sometimes.
Yeah, it's an interesting one because, like, often when we say things like unreliable narrator, I think people think that we take that as a negative, like, oh, they're an unreliable narrator, you can't trust them. But that isn't the case here. It's that an unreliable narrator can also be a narrator who is colored by experience, and that's something that doesn't mean that we shouldn't trust them or we shouldn't like them, but it's something that's just important to keep in mind. Whereas Victor Frankenstein is an unreliable narrator because he is an arrogant asshole, Jane is an unreliable narrator because she knows what happens at the end. She knows that these things should have happened. She's worked to make sure that, the children under her care don't have that experience, that, certain things don't happen. She's looking back with a bias that isn't necessarily unearned or kind of like unjustified. We all have our biases. And I think that's something to really keep in mind when we're thinking about the narration in this novel, because, Jane never goes, oh, if only, like, when you read things like Fielding, it's always like, oh, had I but known then what I know now, and such was about to befall me, and never again would I have such a beautiful, and you're like, oh God, okay. Like, it's very me. Jane is telling the story because she wants you to understand something. She wants you to know something. She sees the value in her own story, not necessarily because she's such an amazing individual, but because she understands it. And you have that meta aspect of Charlotte Bronte is also writing this from similar aspects of experience. So I do think you have a really fascinating gender divide between an unreliable narrator like Victor and a narrator like Jane. And that's not just me being biased because I like Jane and I don't like Victor.
Don't hold back about Victor. There's
a reason. But Jane is telling her story. These are her experiences, so it's true to her. These are her truths, and this is what she remembers and what she experienced. Whereas I think something like Frankenstein or other texts, you have, it's Victor Frankenstein is narrating something to justify his actions. He's just something bad and he made a mess and he's trying to justify it. Whereas this is something different because it's someone's recollections. And even though everyone has biases and recollects things differently. It's still true to you. That's how you experience them. I think. Yeah. I mean, it's interesting that she starts where she does, where she could have started a lot younger. And there's a lot of studies that say that our first memory is often a traumatic memory, around the age of like 2, and it's one that's associated with something that's traumatic as a infant, but it might not be traumatic, as an adult or something like that. But she doesn't choose to start there. But it's also, it's that idea of it's true to you. This is what you remember, and this is your experiences, and your memory shapes who you are. And that's what she's telling. So yes, she's unreliable in the fact that she has biases, and she might misremember certain things, but that's fine.
Yeah. Well, we're about to meet another new character, Miss Miller. And Bruce has a comment here. Hello, Ghoul Guides. He says, as a book, Jane Eyre tends to add many characters over the course of the story. Chapter 5 alone introduces us to 3 new characters. Was this an unusual structure for books of the mid-19th century, or was this a commonly used device, I guess, to introduce so many new characters into a story and have them keep coming in? So what do you guys think?
No, it's actually really common.
Especially thinking Dickens back here on the wall.
Yeah,
like, you get a new character a chapter.
Yes, and in a lot of the 18th century texts, Radcliffe does this all the time. Key characters don't come in until halfway through. And like the Mysteries of Udolpho, the second half introduces this kind of secondary heroine, and you're like, who the hell is this? Like, where does she come from? Like, how does she fit into the narrative? But no, it's quite a common trope to not introduce everybody at the beginning of a text, and quite often you don't get the key players on screen until much later. But yeah, it's quite common, mostly because we're still thinking a lot about realism at this point in time. You meet people, you don't meet all the major characters kind of at the beginning, or like one by one. You meet 3 people at a time, or 2 people at a time, or a family at a time. So it is kind of trying to mimic that, but no, it's quite common to kind of throw characters in quite large numbers in. And some texts, Francis Lathan's The Midnight Bell, which is one of the horrid novels that is in Northanger Abbey, introduces a character and then kills them off like 3 pages later. You often do kind of cycle through these, and Mary knows more about this, but in like things like Melmoth, multiple characters popping up telling their story all the way through. So yeah, it's actually quite the way Bronte does it is actually a lot more believable, I would say. I think she's actually a lot more natural about it, than some of the writers, particularly kind of 10 or 20 years before.
But it is noticeably different from modern novels, in that structure in a modern novel is so tight. Yes. and an editor is going to say, wow, these people aren't important to the story or furthering it, so they shouldn't really be there. And even in 1840 647, when she's writing and publishing this novel, the rules for writing a novel aren't really set yet. People are still figuring it out, and
it's only like
what to do with this kind of narrative structure, right?
Yeah, the form is only 150 years old, and for the first 50-60 years of the novel's existence, you either wrote as fake life writing or in letters. We don't have many non-epistolary, non-life writing novels until the later part of the 18th century, and that's why writers like Austen and Shelley caused such a stir, because Austen uses free and direct speech. Shelley writes, these like historical style novels and things like Valperga and Perkin Warbeck. The French Revolution is really the point where everyone goes, okay, well, what can we do with this novel form? Can we tell historical novels? Can we tell fantasy novels? Like, how do we write novels? So really, in terms of the novel as a format that's not just this new experimental thing, it's only about 60-70 years old by the time Bronte is writing. It's very, very new. And really what she's doing is going back to that realism. you know, this is the tale of a real person. This is an autobiographical novel, you know, going back to something like, you know, Tom Jones or some of these kind of mid 18th century texts and kind of making them female focused. But yeah, we have to remember that this is still a new form. You know, if we think about poetry and plays, they become very experimental in the 19th century because they've been around for hundreds of years, and you can be experimental. The novel is still a baby. You know, it's still very much a baby in the 19th century, and it's
like
really only
more like a toddler.
Yeah, like a toddler, like it's finding its feet. Does that make modernism like and postmodernism like it's teenage rebellion? Like,
yeah, I don't know. That might be. Yeah, that might be. Yeah, that might be.
I think that's a really good analogy, because modernism does some really weird things with the novel form. Definitely a
like
teenager
wearing its hair over one eye and like flicking it. It's like, you don't understand me.
Is a novel
Nobody
ever going to grow
me.
up? Grow up, novel. All right. Well, we meet Miss Miller here, and her description of Miss Miller is so interesting, and throughout this chapter, the way Miss Miller was more ordinary, ruddy in complexion, and he describes her as, you know, this kind of very obviously an under teacher, but she takes time to describe her as not an extraordinary character, and also it introduces us to Charlotte Bronte as this super pinpoint you know, observer of how people look and behave and how she reads them right off the bat. This is very important for her. You want to add something to that, Lauren, because you pulled out your book?
I just I don't know if any of you are familiar. So Roger Luckhurst has a book about corridors that is fantastic.
Roger Luckhurst,
it's about corridors. I can't remember. So the lecture he gave, he was our like Christmas lecture a few years ago, and the lecture was called Corridor Dread. And I can't remember what the book's called because I always just call it the Roger Luckhurst Corridor book.
Corridors, Progress, Passages of Modernity.
That's it. So when she says, you know, led by her, I passed from compartment to compartment, from passage to passage of a large and irregular building, it reminds me of what he says about them being this kind of, he talks about things like hotels where like every single corridor is the same and you have that like awful patterned carpet, but he talks a lot about, you know, how these are spaces that repeat and that, you know, you have to go down them to get somewhere, but they seem to, you know, be maze-like because it's the same thing over and over again, and you struggle to find your point along them and things like that, and that it can be a very traumatic experience. And he talks about things like The Shining, you know, but this moment here as well, that it's compartment after compartment, passage after passage, that it's all repeating, it's the same, but she's traveling through it, and it's almost like you get that impression that she couldn't find her way back if she wanted to. And I just think it
seems very maze-like.
Yes.
And then you know but we've had this in Gothic novels and exploring the, you know, the passages of the castle or the mansion.
Yeah, and I guess I just kind of want to think about like that image and how that repeats throughout the text, you know, in different places. But yeah, just when I was rereading it, I haven't read this since that book came out, and I was just rereading this and I thought, oh god, that actually is a great example.
Interesting too that something like that kind of structure is kind of put in this what is really supposed to be an ordinary world. This is just a school that you're going to, but it has, you know, greater meaning because of its labyrinthine nature. Well, before we get her to meet the other girls, let me do my little mid-break here. We bring Sundays with Jane Eyre to all of you for free. So if you'd like to support the Rosenbach through donation, you can do so at our website. And since this novel was published in 1847, we're asking for donations of $18.47 to support the show. I'd like to thank some of you already who have made a donation of $18.47. And if you do that, I'll call your name out on the show and thank you. And that's thanks to Britta from Hamburg, Germany, Gina from Ackworth, Georgia, and Melissa from Houston, Texas. If you're all watching today, thank you very much. But you could also become a member of the Rosenbach. Members of the Rosenbach get free and exclusive access to some programs, plus 10% off any of our reading courses, 50% off of any Rosenbach programs. And we have a bunch of new memberships among our Airhead audience here. And I want to thank Meg from Davidsonville, Maryland, Carolyn from Waterford, New Jersey, Lynn from Mount Holly, New Jersey, Natalie from Rutledge, PA, Debbie from Wayne, PA, Demita from Schaumburg, Illinois, Gretchen from Philadelphia, PA, Bruce from Cooperstown, New York, Kate from Doylestown, PA, Brianna from Glenside, PA, Irene from Birmingham, Alabama, Eunice from Philly, Laura from Philly, and Lynn from Philly. All of you guys joined up and you're also registered for Jane Eyre. And I want to thank you all for becoming members. Thanks for joining. We also have brand new Sundays with Jane Eyre merchandise, mugs, t-shirts, and stickers with our logo on them. You can buy them while supplies last at our website. And remember, we have an official bookseller for Sundays with Jane Eyre, a novel idea on Passyunk. It's a great little bookstore in South Philadelphia, but they're also online, so you can purchase from them online. You can buy editions of Jane Eyre, and all the Brontean books we mentioned on our show can be ordered through their website. So... And you guys do you have anything to put? You have the interview with Kathleen Hudson, but you guys should know you can always plug too. So
we have a talk on this Saturday coming, Saturday the 16th. It might be a bit early for some of you guys. I'm not 100% sure how the time difference works, but we're doing a talk for the Bromley House Library, which is a fantastic private library in Nottingham, which is where I live, and it's beautiful. If you go on their website, you can see they have this fantastic staircase. So we're doing a talk about the weird and wonderful legacy of the Gothic. The tickets are £4, so not a lot, and all of the money they make goes back into the library and keeping the library open.
And it's virtual. Is it
it's
virtual
really
or is
beautiful.
this in person?
It is indeed virtual. It's Zoom. Okay. So if you would like to start your Saturday somewhat early, but with the Ghoul Guides, then you can do that.
We have
to go early for 11? You have to come late for us.
Yeah.
If you have a link, could you put the link in the chat, and then I'll also share the link on our other things.
Yeah, so that's what we're doing on the horizon.
Excellent. Back to the story. Jane comes in. She into the room with all the other girls. And there's a pitcher of water and the mug in the middle of each tray on the table. Portions are handed round. If the mug, it's a common mug that everybody at the one table uses, and then they get a thin oaten cake shared into fragments. And just this idea, and I only bring it up because it'll get emphasized over these next two chapters: their diet, what they're eating. How spare it is, and this is all very much the fare that Charlotte had to eat at the school that she was sent off to as a child. The beds are 2 to a bed. She shares a bed with Miss Miller tonight, but then she says she'll share with another girl coming up. And then when they wake up the next day, there's 1 basin to 6 girls to wash themselves with in the front of the room. So no wonder so many, germs and diseases are spreading throughout these schools. And not that they didn't know. I mean, they don't know germ, they don't have that idea of how germs spread. So germ theory isn't around yet. No, that's not till later.
No, not for it's still like miasma and things like that at this point in time.
But they go to eat their porridge in the morning, and it is burnt again. The odor from it, they know as soon as they walk into the room. Disgusting. The porridge is burnt again. She says, burnt porridge is almost as bad as rotten potatoes. Famine itself soon sickens over it. and each girl tasted her food and tried to swallow it, but most of them just had to give up. I did think of calling this episode Burnt Porridge, but that would be a little Dickensian, I think. So I left that one alone. But the idea that this is the kind of, gross things that they had to eat, and the school that Charlotte and her two older sisters and Emily briefly were sent to, this Cohenbridge school, led by founded by the Reverend William Carus Wilson. It was actually called the Clergy Daughters School at Cohenbridge. And Wilson, though, was far more of a Calvinist preacher than Patrick Bronte, but hey, it was a school for preachers' kids. This is great. My kids can go there kind of rather cheaply. So they went. Maria was 10 when she goes, and Elizabeth is 9. And these are the two older Bronte sisters, everyone, that no one knows about, because we think of the 3 Bronte sisters, because the older 2 died because they went to this school, probably. And Charlotte's only 8 and Emily's 6. Typhoid fever hits the school. Maria and Elizabeth die. Actually, they die of tuberculosis, though, but it's just horrific that Charlotte has to go through this as a small child, and the kids aren't taken out until too late. But the stories about the food are all the same. We hear like this rotten food that they had to eat, and it's bad food, bad living conditions, and the routine of what she has to go through, or what Jane has to go through, or all what Charlotte Bronte, experienced herself in the Cohen school.
This is such like a key moment, because it's such a far departure from the schools of the kind of long 18th century, because you had schools essentially for gentlemen's daughters, and that was usually widows or like emigres. And I mean, they were usually widows, or they pretended to be widows because that was respectable. But that was usually, you went and it would be 10 or 15 girls at this school, sometimes bigger. You lived in a house, you learnt needlework, and it was more of a finishing style school. But if you wrote home and said the food was terrible, and like all of these things happened, then your parents might take you out of school and stop paying. This is such a drastic departure, because there's this huge shift in theories of education, and we move away from the Rousseauian, oh yes, children should be free and they should go on walks, because all of these schools would be like in the countryside, and they would take walks. And if you've seen adaptations of Emma, you see things like this, the girls kind of walking in pairs and stuff, and you have this shift that comes in around like Calvinist like thinking and literature that is, no, children's education, there should be like struggling, and they should learn to be humble and resilient, and this is really important. And that particularly for girls of the middle classes or the lower classes, that there's been too much extravagance. There's been we've just come out of the Regency, and things like Brighton Pavilion have been built. Too much extravagance. To raise good girls, they need to be experiencing these hardships. And boys' schools also have a similar thing. There was common idea that you should beat boys because you needed to literally beat the violence out of them, that they had to sleep on hard beds to understand hardship and push the kind of terrible masculine urges out of them. But this is such a drastic change to what a lot of people reading this novel would have experienced at school. We're still at a period of time where most of the literary book buying classes are the more affluent middle classes. So this kind of, I know I always say I'm not a Dickens fan, and that is very true, unfortunately. I'm sorry for my sins, but this is a very Dickensian moment, because it is specifically highlighting to the readership, to the genteel public, like, by the way, do you know what is happening to these children in the name of education and good Christian morals? Because it is doing neither of those things. So yeah, just from like an education perspective, this is one of the kind of turning point texts where we actually start to see in fiction these realities.
Yes. Let's just move on. There's a moment here where Jane mentions and how she's describing everybody, and now how she sees it's Miss Temple that comes in, and how she comes in, and Jane says, "I suppose I have a considerable organ of veneration, for I retain yet the sense of admiring all with which my eyes traced her steps." And I just wanted to annotate that for some of the readers, this organ of veneration. This is a phrenological term. Phrenology, it's all about the bumps and the kind of hollows of your skull, and it kind of, it tells you everything about your person. It's almost like a horoscope for your skull. And in George Combs' A System of Phrenology, published around the same time as this, this organ is the organ of veneration. This organ is situated in the middle of the coronal region of the brain. It's kind of like right on the side here. But the veneration is an emotion of profound, this is from Combe, an emotion of profound and reverential respect on perceiving an object as once great and good. It is the source of natural religion, of that tendency to worship a superior power, which manifests itself in almost every tribe of men yet discovered. But also veneration leads to deference for superiors in knowledge, virtue, and rank, as well as in years, and prompts to the reverence of authority. It all makes me think that, like, if the one thing that the young Jane has shown that she has not, in a sense, is that reverence for authority, but all of this text makes the point that, like, it's reverence for true authority, great and good authority. And that is what she's noticing here in Miss Temple right off the bat, and why she's able to key into it. And there's one other line here I just want to throw out here. The organ is generally larger in the female head than in the male. But this is because women are more obedient and prone to devotion than men, according to this text. So there you go. So
definitely describes me so accurately.
That's when he totally lost the Jane Eyre connection to more obedient, and yeah, that's not going to happen with this kid.
I think describing phrenology as a horoscope, or like a horoscope, is exactly right. I mean, it's just nonsense and pseudoscience, but people did believe it.
And Charlotte Bronte's all in on it. This is not the only work of hers that talks about this.
Yeah,
it was really popular.
It was really popular, and I mean, we talked about it in Sundays with Dracula, and with Dracula's skull shape and how it showed that he was evil. And here is the converse. It's something about Jane that shows that she's actually good. But yeah, it's nonsense.
Any thoughts, you guys, on Miss Temple here? I mean, she really describes her. Tall, fair, shapely, brown eyes, she describes her clothes, the purple cloth and the Spanish trimming of black velvet, her gold watch, refined features, complexion. This is the 19th century. This is really definitely the early novel way of describing someone to admire.
Oh yeah. And when you compare it to some of the other descriptions that are only kind of like one or two descriptors, it kind of does that thing to work where it's like you as a reader should take notice of it, but also notice how much of an impact this had on 10-year-old child Jane, who is recalling as an adult this story that she still remembers.
Yeah.
The way that the watch, shone at the girdle, and that wasn't very common at the time, and the way that her complexion was, and that's quite, it's almost like that moment where, like, if this was on camera, she'd kind of come in slow motion and the background would be like blurred out. That this is a really important moment for Jane, but also because of what she remembers of Miss Temple afterwards, that this is her thinking back to the first time she saw her and having that thing of like, yes, this was such an important person in my life, such an influential person. And it's you know, it's a really interesting in many ways description, because Bronte does this quite well, that you get descriptions of people where they're quite normal looking people, you know, then it's not like the Gothic novel description where it's like, she was the most beautiful, pure thing that had ever been seen in the world. Her beauty was so much that the king cried. Like, it's, you know, she's describing real people, like normal people, but she does it in such a way that you get this beautiful kind of mental portrait in that even if this is a relatively normal looking person, you're able to see the beauty that, you know, comes with their character, or that Jane sees, or that, you know, Charlotte, if she's describing someone based on a real person, saw. And I think that kind of that realism moment again, that she's writing in a way that is, you know, not everybody is so beautiful that people cry or faint or swoon, you know, but people are real and natural, and this is, you know, how they are perceived. And she does that really, really well in moments like this when she describes Miss Temple.
And then Miss Temple gets to come in and be heroic because their porridge was burnt. She gives them all bread and cheese. You know, bread and cheese for everyone. You know, she's like the Oprah of Lowood. You get bread and cheese. You get bread and cheese. Everybody gets bread and cheese, and it's just bread and cheese. But it's this like little moment of something really, you know, good and special for these like. And what does it say about this school that this is the heroic moment so far?
Yeah,
because that's what they have to, you know, go through this time. I want to get to we're going to meet Helen in a moment. I definitely want to spend some time with her. But there is a moment here that I passed over quickly, and I wanted to. It's in the description of Miss Temple, and she says, "Let the reader add to complete the picture refined features, a complexion of pale, clear, etc." The reader, right there. That's the first time we'll have that in this novel, and it's something that occurs, and it's, of course, you know, later it'll be the most famous, in one of the most famous lines. But do you guys notice that, or you have anything? I think it's, and this is the first time, and obviously we're reading a first person narrator, and she's kind of inserted herself at times, saying like, this is me telling you now, later, what's going on. But this kind of establishing the relationship, in a sense, I get from this. When you use the word reader, then the narrator is saying, we have a kind of relationship. You're the reader and I'm the narrator. And it's something that should be obvious, but I don't know. I was just this was running through my head as I was prepping notes, and I was wondering if you guys had any thoughts on the narrator addressing us as readers.
I always think with this text that you're getting an early example of a really powerful feminist literary convention that Margaret Atwood is very famous for. And a lot of Atwood's fiction does this thing where it's like, and Handmaid's Tale is the most famous example, but it happens as well in The Blind Assassin, in Alias Grace. You have this kind of thing of like, who am I writing this for? And in The Handmaid's Tale, the narrator basically says, you are the reader, and I don't know who you are, and I don't know anything about you, but you exist, and because you exist and you are reading this text, you are important, and you're important to me, because the purpose of this text is that I, the writer, write this for you, the reader, and I will you into existence, that by the act of me writing, that makes you the reader, whoever you are. And Jane Eyre kind of as a text does this quite a lot, you know, when the narrator says, you know, I won't, no spoilers, but there's a very famous line towards the end of the text where she says, you know, reader something, and you know, when she calls upon the reader, she's doing it in that kind of way that's like, your participation in this act of me storytelling is what makes it storytelling. And it differs it from the kind of omniscient narration of some of the kind of earlier first person texts, where it's just, I tell the text in first person as if it's happening, as if I have gone back and I am watching my life play out as it's happening. And I am simply speaking it, and this is about me. I'm the narrator, I'm the protagonist, you're not important. What's important is only that I convince you a certain way. This is very much more about the interconnection. And what the Gothic does in the 18th century is really prioritizes the relationship between writer and reader. This is a language that exists between women writers and women readers. And within these texts, we may have a dialogue where we can talk about things that are subversive and transgressive and taboo, and we can share the dangers. You know, the Gothic analogy shares the dangers, like, be careful of these types of men, be careful of these types of things. So we have this established convention of the Gothic novel is conversation between women. What we then get over the 19th century, and Jane Eyre is perhaps the most noticeable example, and I think the one that so many think about, how many women write novels about Jane Eyre or inspired by Jane Eyre. You know, Jane Eyre is such a key text because Charlotte Bronte as narrator, as Jane, wills the reader into existence, and by willing the reader into existence, it empowers the readers to become the writer and then communicate with other readers. And you get the continuation of this cycle of the Gothic novel is a conversation, and because it's a conversation, it doesn't end when you put the book down. You, the reader, are an active participant in Jane's narration, and I personally think that's why it's one that we get so many interactions with, because it actively, openly invites you to do that. You know, you are the reader, you're just as important as me, the narrator, because if I'm telling the story to nobody, the story doesn't exist. You know, if there's no, like, it's a two-way street. And I think that is the kind of key thing here. Like, it talks so much more about this as like a feminist literary concept, and anyone that is a fan of that would, I think, you know, you see it really beautifully done in like a contemporary text there. But yeah, for me, this is that conversation. This is using literature and using the novel to remind that this is not just an open and shut, you know, it's not just an open and shut book, it is a conversation, it is a back and forth, and it's inviting you to be an active participant intentionally to kind of, you know, it's not just a didactic text that says this is what you should do, your opinion doesn't matter, this is the way it works. It's reminding you that you have a part, and that really is what makes it such a powerful text, for me.
Good.
That one, I realized I got really
I like
tense
that.
about that.
And it's something small in the text that I think has something going on there bigger than what is going on, and I couldn't find the words for it. Thank you. that really works for me. But we do have a lot of text to get through. We're still in chapter 5. Out in the garden, walled-in garden that's blight and brown decay. It's not nice out there. It's cold. And I heard frequently the sound of a hollow cough. And this will come up again in a moment. But before that, she notices the sign on the wall, Lowood Institution. And she says, I was still pondering the signification of institution when she hears the sound of a cough close beside me, and it made me turn my head. And then somebody had a question. Adam has a question. When Jane first meets Helen and she first of all hears a cough, would readers at that time immediately think of TB? My answer is yeah.
Yeah.
It's all over this, and I think, you know, it's the sense of, I'm not trying to give you people spoilers, but no, when coughing children doesn't mean that, you know, they smoke and they have like, it means they are ill is what it means. And tuberculosis consumption, what they call it then, is just so prevalent now. Obviously, you know, Charlotte knows it firsthand because, you know, her 2 older sisters, you know, died from tuberculosis. And it is someone also, Pauline had asked that, is there any reason to think one of Jane's sister who died in early childhood had attributes of Helen? And everybody seems to believe that yes, Helen Burns is Charlotte's older sister, Maria, and the way the family always talked about her and revered her, and she was so angelic and perfect, just as Helen is going to be described soon, that this is Charlotte's way of writing about her older sister. But yeah, you meet her and she's coughing.
Yeah, because even if it's not consumption, I can see people talking about things like pertussis, which is whooping cough. People would get a cold and die. This is a time where you get this so often in life writing, in commonplace books. You'll get, oh, mama had a bit of a cough today, and 4 days later mama is dead. Like these, because especially with TB, and you see this unfortunately with all the Bronte sisters, particularly Emily and Anne, we don't know when they got TB. Emily and Anne could have had TB their entire lives, because we know that Elizabeth and Maria have it very early on. We don't know if they get it at school. We don't know if they have it beforehand. It was such a prevalent disease, and it can sit dormant for, people have latent tuberculosis that can then become active because of another infection. So something like typhoid, something like whooping cough. But we have just this completely, rife period of sudden or constant infections and diseases that claim lives very quickly or very slowly and very painfully. And there's, multiple things going around. So yeah, you do get that kind of, we've moved away from the Burkean illness, which is like, oh, she's a little pale and she's a little sickly, and that's beautiful. And we're into this kind of like, period of illnesses spread like wildfire. We don't understand why. And a cough or a pallid demeanor, it's something that you worry about because it's a death flag, essentially. This is a period of particularly this kind of mid-19th century point of, we start to, in like 10-20 years time, we're going to get dysentery like ripping through cities like wildfire. So whenever there's that thing of like a cough or a sniffle or something, it is usually, unfortunately, a sign, and it's actually used by quite a lot of writers. But yeah, the introduction of her, we hear her cough before we see her. The Gothic does this often, where we hear something before we see them, and usually the thing you hear is supposed to it's supposed to signify. So like Mary talked about this when we did our Gothic Awakenings a while ago, like in Otranto, the girls hear the hero before they see him, and they're like, well, he must be a good guy because he sings beautifully. So it is like a thing about like, what do you hear before you see someone, and unfortunately what we hear here is a cough.
Helen coughs, she turns, sees her, and she's reading Raselas. Samuel Johnson, here he is. She's reading the history of Raselas, Prince of Abyssinia, which for those who might not have a note in your book, it's kind of a parable. It's a very short novel, very thin book. It is a parable about a prince who escapes a kind of blissful ignorance life in the happy valley, his kingdom, and he searches for kind of true happiness in a corrupt world. And one of the notes in one of these chapters has this quote from it you see frequently with this, and it is, human life is everywhere a state in which much is to be endured and little to be enjoyed. That life is about enduring, not enjoying, and this is the kind of pessimistic kind of mindset of this work. And this has a lot to do with, obviously, I think, Helen and how she sees life, and I think this book is chosen very purposefully. And I'll have another quote later that ties in with things that Helen says about Raselas. So, you guys read much Johnson, or? Any? Just curious. Yeah.
No, he's
like
like he's kind of like just before my like specialism. Unfortunately, I have read more of the other famous Samuel of that era for my
But so influential, and Bronte knows him well, and all the early authors know. I mean, Jane Austen mentions Johnson frequently, and he still has this influence going on into the first half of the 19th century.
And important to note as well that Johnson was often included as one of the required readings. Like, this is, you know, his work were works that you were supposed to read. You know, you were supposed to read, like, you know, a bit of Shakespeare, a bit of Milton, a bit of Johnson, a bit of Richardson, and they were like your required readings when you, particularly if you were like educated at home by your mother.
I like him because he's a big fat ugly guy, like, and I love that.
He also, you probably are all familiar with the meme of Johnson where he's like looking at the it's a really
blinking Sam, the picture, because he couldn't see it all. He had a whole book right up to his eyes to read them.
And the internet loves that painting.
Joshua Reynolds painting, blinking Sam. It's like nicknamed, and Johnson hated it. Johnson hated it after he had painted it. So, but Raselas is what she's reading, and then Jane proceeds to just riddle Helen with questions. You can tell Jane's not really a reader yet, because this is what readers hate. Hey, what are you reading? What's it about? Hey, what's this over here? And like, I'm trying. And then Helen finally at the end was like, I'm trying to read. But what Helen tells her, at least at first, about, you know, well, Miss Temple's really nice, and Brocklehurst is a clergyman and is said to do a great deal of good. I like Helen's choice of language there. Is said to do a great deal of good. Helen doesn't come out and say people are no good, but she knows the score, and how Miss Temple is really nice. She's good and clever. She knows more than everybody else. And then Helen tells her to shut up. You ask rather too many questions. And now I want to read. And then I'm going to get to the next. Well, that happens to the next. Is it the next chapter? Yeah, because we're almost done this chapter. But just to finish this chapter, and they get their delicious rusty meat stew here, indifferent potatoes and strange shreds of rusty meat mixed and cooked together. I don't want to eat that. I love the word rusty, that it doesn't mean the same as what we have. It's more like rancid for you know, the purposes of this text, but rusty is not good. Helen, I'm sorry, I have to mention this quickly because Helen is punished. And punished, you know, badly, and it seems to be she's sent to stand in the middle of the room, and I expected she would show great distress, but Helen doesn't. She's very composed. She looks as if she were thinking of something beyond her punishment, beyond her situation, of something not round her nor before her. And then we'll get more of this in the next chapter. But Helen is already portrayed to us as a kind of she's like not from here, innocent, like, you know, like she's not of this realm. And am I getting that wrong? That she seems like she's not. She's
already looking beyond. And you can see that in terms of physically, that she's daydreaming about being somewhere else, or you can look at that in terms of, you know, spiritual planes. Like, she's not in the kind of physical realm anymore. She's beyond that. She's looking towards what's next. So it's kind of hinted here implicitly, and then you get more of that in the next chapter. But
and especially in the next chapter, we're in chapter 6 now, where, you know, the Miss Scatcherd, that's a Dickensian name, huh? Like, you know, that Miss Scatcherd is constantly just on her. Burns, you're standing on the side of your shoe. Burns, you poke your chin most unpleasantly. Burns, I insist on your hold. And it's not even that Helen doesn't know the answers. She does, but she still gets, you dirty, disagreeable girl, because she doesn't have her nails clean. And then she gets beaten for that. And Jane's gone from this one life where she recognizes all the injustice that occurs at the Reeds, to now she's in, an institution that does it as well. But she, accepts it, and Helen goes and gets the bundle of twigs and accepts her punishment. And Jane can't understand this. Why would she accept? Because Jane has decided she's not accepting, this kind of, unjust punishment again. But let's get to that, because then she encounters Helen a little after that. On the evening of the day I'd seen Miss Scatcherd flog her pupil Burns. This is when she has her first, conversation, or her second conversation with her. They really get into this. She's just finished Raselas. What do we have here? She asked her where she's from. Even Helen's response there, will you ever go back to where north, near the borders of Scotland? Jane said, we ever go back? And Helen's response is what? I hope so, but nobody can be sure of the future. That's not the way kids usually respond. And then Jane has these issues where, Jane thinks you should dislike her. I should dislike her. I should resist her. If she struck me, I'd break it under her nose. Jane thinks that she's going to be this little, battling rebel here. And Helen, the reality is Helen lets her know, you can't, because you'd get kicked out. None of that would work. But it's Helen's kind of philosophy. And this is where I get the title for this episode, this doctrine of endurance that Helen comes up with here. You want to read some of that? Yet it would be your duty. You see where that is? Either one of you, yep. Mary? Or
you want to go, Mary, or do you want me to go?
You can go if you've got it.
Okay. Yes, it would be your duty to bear it if you could not avoid it. It is weak and silly to say you cannot bear what it is your fate to be required to bear. I heard her with wonder. I could not comprehend this doctrine of endurance, and still less could I understand or sympathize with the forbearance she expressed for her chastiser. Still, I felt that Helen Burns considered things by a light invisible to my eyes. I suspected she might be right and I wrong, but I would not ponder the matter deeply, like Felix. I put it off to a more convenient season.
A light invisible to my eyes. That's a line about Helen and this duty to bear it. You got anybody have a gloss on like Felix? I put it off to a more convenient season. I think I have Acts of the Apostles. That's from. No, either you guys have that? No, I could barely find it in my notes, but it's Felix is a governor of Judea who imprisoned the Apostle Paul, and okay. Sometimes this is he imprisons him and he's telling him that he'll punish him when he has in a convenient season, then he'll let him out. But I don't know, and then he's not mentioned again. But it seems to be a character that 19th century people knew, but also the idea too that Jane Eyre or Charlotte Bronte, for all the criticism she gets from some people like Rigby about being unchristian, she knows her Bible and she gets all the references and she adds these references into her text. But this doctrine of endurance, this forbearance, this is another line from Raselas when he talks about the choice of life is become less important. I hope this is later in the novel when he's done his travels kind of thing. I hope hereafter to think only on the choice of eternity. And somebody I think the Oxford edition of Jane Eyre pointed out that quote from Raselas. I didn't know it, like right off. Like I was like, that reminds me of something from Raselas. There was somebody on the Oxford, thank you, editor of the Oxford Jane Eyre, pointed that out. But that's another situation where I think Raselas is important to this text, and Charlotte Bronte must have had it in mind when she was coming up with Helen's ideas here about endurance and forbearance. And is this the advice that Jane needs to hear, or is this, say, more just about Helen and the way she has to go through her life? That's my big question for you guys. Mary, you first.
I think this is why Helen's really interesting, especially when you compare her to other characters like Brocklehurst and St John. In that, I think Jane is more receptive to what Helen is saying. She doesn't necessarily agree with it entirely, and especially towards the end of this chapter, Helen is very much focused about death and the afterlife and those kinds of ideas. But here you have the idea that suffering and endurance is what it is to live, especially for Helen. I don't think that Jane agrees with either of what we'll get to later, but even this idea of I must endure and I must suffer, and that is what's meant to be my life. But it is very much this idea of she quotes a lot. So in this chapter, there's quite a lot from the Sermon of the Mount and Matthew. And the idea, so that's basically a big passage in Matthew where you get a lot of key ideas of Christian concepts and Christian ideas. And the one key thing is the idea of turn the other cheek, which is completely different to the idea of an eye for an eye. And I think that's something that Helen's example and Helen's story and Helen's suffering and the endurance is telling Jane that it's not just about revenge or getting what's due. You can turn the other cheek, and she does this in when she gets hit a while before. She's clearly upset, but she accepts it, not because she thinks that it's just and right, but because she is forgiving the person that's doing it to her and accepting that kind of wrongdoing. So I think that's partly a lesson that Jane kind of takes on. But again, I don't think that Jane necessarily agrees with everything that Helen is saying.
Before we run ahead with it too, I just think you mentioned that this kind of Matthew and maybe turn the other cheek, that kind of but on the Lowood Institution sign, there's a very different quote from Matthew, right?
And that I've got that in my notes. So the thing that they're quoting there is Matthew 5:16, which is again from the Sermon on the Mount, and Jane says that. She was pondering the signification of institution and endeavoring to make out a connection between the first words of the sign and the verse of scripture. So the sign says, Lowood Institution, this portion was rebuilt by Naomi Brocklehurst of Brocklehurst Hall in this county. And then the quote, the scripture verse, let your light so shine before men that they may see your good works and glorify your Father which is in heaven. So the idea that, you should do good for the glory of God. But obviously here the focus is on it's the Brocklehurst and the Brocklehurst family, and it's that kind of idea.
Look what we've done, God.
Yeah, exactly.
Which is more about them than
and again later in the same sermon in Matthew, you have the idea of you shouldn't do good just for men to see, just for other humans to see. You should do it. You don't have to be public. But that I think is quite a kind of a dichotomy, like a really different, something that Jane struggles with specifically with this school, the idea that it is for show, and it contradicts the ideas. It's even on that sign and that idea of Matthew and the ideas that Charlotte Bronte knew her scripture, and she's using it here for specific reasons, and it's all about hypocrisy. And the idea of doing things for show, and the idea that charity and philanthropy doesn't necessarily mean good. Someone said, Helen's response to, is Mr. Brocklehurst good? She says he's a clergyman. And the idea that that doesn't necessarily mean good. And charity, philanthropy, charitable institutions don't necessarily mean good.
Helen understands Matthew seems better than, the Brocklehursts do. So, couple little passages of Helen. At first that she talks about, I fall into a sort of dream when she's supposed to be listening to her lessons. Sometimes I think I am in Northumberland and that the noises I hear around me are the bubbling of a little brook which runs through Deepden near our house. Then when it comes to my turn to reply, I have to be awakened, and having heard nothing of what was read, for listening to the visionary brook, I have no answer ready. More of that. Helen is, I live in another realm than you all are in all the time. But then this whole passage about Charles I and then about, well, and then there's more, but Miss Temple makes it easy for Helen to be good, she says. So that's not an accomplishment if she's good with her. It's because Miss Scatcherd is so hard that suffering has to happen for Helen, it seems to me, for her to be good. Like Charles, she's talking about Charles I here, and that she's does she see herself already as a kind of a martyr? I mean, she's a saint or a martyr, like Catholic or Protestant,
I think Helen recognizes, because, the bit where she says, I'm careless, I forget rules, I read when I should learn my lessons, I have no method. What Bronte is kind of drawing attention to here is something that we're still having conversations about, particularly with kids with ADHD and kids with neurodivergence, is that Helen doesn't fit. She doesn't fit the mold. And the problem is that this is kind of what I was saying back in the first week about the revolutionary aspects of this novel, that it's not actually revolutionary because everyone's already said this. But by the time, by 1847, a lot of this has kind of been forgotten. We've gone from the Rousseauian natural individual to you must be conformed. You must, to produce goodness, we must do these things, and social rules must exist in the way they exist to avoid the excesses, because we have seen what happens when excess happens. We have seen what happens when, I know I always say it's post-Napoleonic, but think about a world that has just seen, this is the first European dictator and in many eyes tyrant in a long time. What happens when somebody is allowed to run away with their own power, and you have this kind of okay, no, you must do it in order, because that's the way. And we do this all the time, let's go back to traditional values. That's what this is essentially doing. That's what's happening at this point in time. And Helen doesn't fit. Helen is the kind of dreamy protagonist of a romantic novel. She doesn't fit into the harsh reality of a Victorian novel. And I think what you have here is that child Jane's kind of not fully able to realize this or recognize this, but when she says to her but you're not wrong, and Helen's oh no, I am, because I do all of these things. And actually I think that moment really speaks up, because Jane's yeah, that's not wrong. I don't see that as wrong. I don't understand how that could be wrong. And Helen's oh no, well, I don't fit, and that means that I have faults. And that means that I'm wrong. She's not saying the system is bad. She's saying, well, I don't fit the system, so it's the teacher's responsibility to make me fit the system. And I think that's where, Mary said, she doesn't fully agree. Jane struggles with that, and I think a lot of readers struggle with that idea.
Is that more of a modern struggle, or do you think? I wanted, I'm going to tell Jane, yeah, keep fighting, kid. But I don't know if even Charlotte thinks that,
I'm always hesitant here of not being really biasly revisionist, because part of me wants to think no, because if you think about, you know, the Romantic period, you would think, yeah, anyone would be like, no, like reject, rebel, you know, that was a real period of individualism and rebellion and exploration. But I don't like, would a mid-19th century reader necessarily have the same reaction? I don't know. What I suspect more is that is what Bronte is trying to push. It's, you should be having that reaction. I don't like that we see this as wrong. And I do think that's why modern readers do kind of latch on to these early elements of the book and Jane's kind of rejections and rebellions, because it speaks very much to us despite the other conservative aspects of the text. But I do think that's why so many people had an issue with it. So yes, maybe it is, you know, it's probably recognized but not necessarily agreed with.
Well, she certainly does seem to want to push this like kind of idea of universal salvation, and this is the way that she sees kind of the universe. And this is towards the very end of chapter 6, this paragraph, she has been unkind to you. Mary, do you want to read some of that or whatever? Do you have any of that marked? And
I mean, it's quite long.
It's a long paragraph. You want to say, like, would you not be happier? And then maybe, I don't know, there's like, I have so much of it in red.
That bit, the bit that I've marked is the bit from where she says, we are and must be one and all.
Start there.
Okay. We are and must be one and all burdened with faults in this world, but the time will soon come when, I trust, we shall put them off in putting off our corruptible bodies, when debasement and sin will fall from us with this cumbrous frame of flesh, and only the spark of the spirit will remain, the impalpable principle of life and thought, pure as when it left the Creator to inspire the creature. Whence it came, it will return, perhaps again to be communicated to some being higher than man, perhaps to pass through gradations of glory, from the pale human soul to brighten to the seraph. Surely it will never, on the contrary, be suffered to degenerate from man to fiend. No, I cannot believe that. I hold another creed, which no one ever taught me, and which I seldom mention, but in which I delight, and to which I cling, for it extends hope to all. It makes eternity a rest, a mighty home, not a terror and an abyss. Besides, with this creed, I can so clearly distinguish between the criminal and his crime. I can so sincerely forgive the first while I abhor the last. With this creed, revenge never worries my heart. Degradation never too deeply disgusts me. Injustice never crushes me too low. I live in calm, looking to the end.
She's the preacher, huh? She's the one that, she's like, she's Joan of Arc here, like, getting up in front of the troops. This, it's like a religion. And then shortly after that, she kind of, she has to like rest. Like, this is some religious ecstasy moment here, the spark of spirit, the gradations of glory. I've mentioned universal salvation a few times. Mary, you have a easy definition of that, with not something that everyone in the 19th century would have believed in, but Charlotte certainly did.
So we've talked about Calvinism before. So Calvinism is the idea that there are certain people who are selected, the select to go on to heaven, and there are certain people who are selected, predestined to go to hell. You also have in this period the rise of Methodism, which is TLDR, just kind of like it's based around good works, essentially. So if you do good, then you're likely to go to heaven. So it's different from the idea that your destiny is already predetermined. Universal salvation is the idea that salvation is open to everyone and anyone, and also within it the idea that hell might not necessarily be eternal, so it might be finite. So it's also kind of drawing on ideas of potentially purgatory, or the idea that eventually everyone will get to heaven, or can get to heaven. So it's like you say, I think Charlotte shared a lot of these ideas.
The idea that if there's a God of love and forgiveness, how would then there wouldn't be eternal punishment from a God of love. And
and hell's always something that a lot of people struggle with, and I think that's why, you know, the especially the early chapters with Brocklehurst are so troubling, because he's so vivid, and you know, a lot of people now who even now have PTSD from their childhood kind of growing up with stories about hell and damnation, knowing that there's a possibility that you might burn forever in a pit of fire isn't exactly nice. And I think a lot of people struggle with that idea, and it's something different to kind of consider that actually maybe there isn't a hell, or maybe it's not something that's eternal, and also heaven is just, I think, a much nicer concept to grapple with, especially if you have, you know, family members or friends that are dying. The idea that you know, or that you think there's a possibility they might be in heaven, it's a lot more comforting than the idea of thinking that, what if they're in hell, and also what if I'm going to hell? So I think, it's a totally different kind of theology to the fire and brimstone's Calvinism. And I think for Helen, who is already looking forward to her end, you know, she probably knows that she's not going to live that long, or there's a possibility that she won't. So it's this idea, it's you know, she's thinking about her own mortality in a way that she understands with her understanding of scripture, but also that is comforting to her, I guess.
Thank you.
If that makes sense.
You know, and it's it's another instance of not just the characters in this novel, but Charlotte Bronte too, seeming to, like, you know, want to assert these, you know, ways of looking at the world, or believing in God, or, you know, and how we should approach things, that is not, it's, you know, it's not the norm at the time. So
and she kind of presents Helen almost like a prophetess, which, you know, again is something that you have this resurgence in the kind of early 19th century of figures like Joanna Southcott, and, you know, Mary Shelley has a character called Beatrice in Valperga who's a prophetess, and you have this kind of recurring theme in kind of like the 1820s and 30s of like these women who, you know, are blessed with some kind of like religious sight. You have a resurgence of interest in Joan of Arc, you know, and, you know, this is a 13-year-old girl, like she can't possibly speak that eloquently, realistically. Like, I know some really smart 13-year-olds, but like she speaks as scripture almost, and I think that I feel like there is this element of this kind of almost preternatural, supernatural otherness with Helen. But rather than it being a supernatural being, she is almost more like a divine being. And that kind of, you know, the fact that she doesn't fit the mold, the fact that she sees things, but this kind of like it kind of links, you know, when she's like being punished, it can't affect her because she's beyond it, you know, she's kind of so far removed from it because she's almost existing on another plane, you know, she's almost like a divine being. And I think you have this kind of moment, these moments where she makes these speeches to Jane, and again, you know, yes, we have this with all novels, how would you possibly remember all of these things? But like, you know, when you're thinking about if this was someone telling a story, that Jane remembers this speech so accurately and that it's so poignant, and, you know, she is almost like this kind of like moment of divine intervention for the young Jane. And again, no spoilers, but think about the way that the scene of her death is represented. I feel like there's a real moment there where it's almost like epiphany. And I think you are almost intentionally supposed to see her as not a saint, because, you know, we're talking about like a Protestant country and tradition, but a kind of prophetess divine type character.
Yeah. And for Charlotte Bronte, I mean, to you know, have her you know, sister Maria, who had already died, inspire this character. It's a way for her, in a sense, to almost kind of bring her back, to give some comfort to herself. But it's the way she, like, this is Maria speaking to me from, you know, from beyond.
Yeah. And also from a completely personal perspective, I always remember thinking, I wonder if that's why she's from the north. Because the border between England and Scotland, particularly Northumberland, is always seen as a really liminal space.
Liminal space, yeah. There we go.
They're not English, they're not Scottish. Like, they have, and you know, Jane says she can barely understand Helen because her accent is so strong, and you know, those border spaces, that she is specifically from Northumberland. I always kind of just felt like that was like a specific reference, that most of these girls are kind of like, you know, South Yorkshire, Midlands, like you do have the Cumberland girl, but yeah, the fact that she's from Northumberland and she imagines like a babbling brook, and she's kind of, it's like, oh yeah, she comes from fairyland.
Yeah. Or at least everywhere has a north. That's Doctor Who reference, everybody. There you go. Well, Helen's head droops, sinks a little lower, and then she kind of, you know, converses with her own thoughts until Miss Scatcherd comes out and has to holler at her to time to come in. Back to reality, Helen. That's that happens at the very last, you know, line of this chapter. So, all righty. Well, we haven't gone over a crazy amount of time. That's pretty good. That's going to be our time for us, I think, when you're on the show. We'll go over like 15 minutes. But we are going to have to end it here. Bronte Swords and Airheads, thanks all for tuning in today. We'll post this recording on our website. And if that's how you're watching, thanks for watching. We have a Sundays with Jane Eyre Facebook group where we can continue the conversation. Look us up on Facebook and join in that conversation, but also go to the Rosenbach's YouTube account and like the Jane Eyre videos. And if you leave comments there, I can respond to them as well. We had a few comments and questions today I didn't hit. I'm actually going to answer those on the Facebook group and via email if necessary. Thanks to our chat, Mrs. Fairfax today, Brianna. Thank you so much for managing the links in the chat today. Again, next week, my co-host will be Michael Stewart, creator of the Bronte Stones Project, and also wrote this Walking the Invisible novel following in the footsteps of the Brontes, following in the Brontes' footsteps. He'll be on the show. That'll be great. We'll be covering chapters 7 and 8. In which Jane and Helen both have to endure punishments from Brocklehurst and Lowood, and that'll be next week. If you're looking for more virtual engagement, head on over to the Rosenbach website. Check out the other virtual offerings we have, including our gallery, gateways, and exhibitions. And the Rosenbach is also open to visit. See our website for how we're making it safe for you to come see our exhibitions and historic house in person. And please support the Rosenbach, which you can do by donation. We're asking for donations of $18.47. 1847 is the year the novel was published, to help support this show, but any donation is welcome. And if you're not already a member, I invite you to join. Lauren Mary, thank you so much, Ghoul Guides, for being here again. And we'll see you again on the second Sunday of November, right?
Yes, we will.
What chapters? I don't even know what chapters they are. That's too far. That's too far away from me.
Some
interesting chapters.
Good.
Yeah, some great chapters coming up.
Send me that link of your talk on Saturday, and I'll make sure we post that everywhere as well. Playing us out over the credits, everyone, will be Pleated Gazelle's Secrets, our closing theme from Pleated Gazelle. And farewell, readers. May you live entirely for and with what you love best on earth. Bye-bye.